Hello again, this is Chip, and I have another response to a creator on YouTube, Tavo San Abri, and this is in response to his video about 6 months ago in which he talked about why he rethought his atheism and why he thought Jesus was the most reasonable or best choice for, I guess, a God to believe in. Um, and while I'm responding to him, I'd like to try to make this a little bit more of a generalized response that talks about, skeptical thinking, about critical thought, about how one determines what is real, what is true, while also addressing his specific claims. So this video, he starts out by saying that he's already accepted that there's a God. He may, or don't know if he made a previous video about that or a later video about why he rethought his atheism and accepted that a God exists in the first place. This is just about why he decided on Jesus. He went through some reasons about what many people say are reasons he might have reconsidered, but he says, no, those were not the reasons that I did. So I don't really know why he decided to think that he needed a God after supposedly not believing in one for a very long time, even when he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And no, that's not revealing anything. He says it himself. So in this video, he's really talking about, he's already accepted that he needs to decide which God is real because he's already decided that a God exists. And he's going through his reasons why he thinks Jesus is the most reasonable. And I found this video very hard to grasp. That's not really the best word for it, but I can't think of a better one right now. I've struggled to understand how one could go from being a lifelong atheist to believing that a God exists to then believing for these reasons that Jesus is that God. Because throughout this video, I find him to be very credulous, to be essentially accepting the theology of Christianity without comparing what the theology of Christianity says versus what's actually in the Bible. And realistically, as someone who grew up Roman Catholic, I was a devout believer. I mean, I've still got my journals from high school, college, and dental school, in which I talk about my faith and my belief and everything that I found so important. I mean, I couldn't even conceive of the idea of God not existing, but here I am in my mid-50s, and I haven't believed that the God of the Bible exists for 20 years. And the more I listen to theologists and apologists, that I simply, and the more I read the Bible, the more I simply cannot imagine ever believing that the God of the Bible or Jesus are actually, I mean, that they exist. I mean, okay, I accept that Jesus as a human being probably existed, tentatively, but that he was divine, that his message was somehow special or anything, I don't get it. I really don't. And as I went through Tavo's video, I was, like I said, I was struck by his apparent just acceptance of what Christianity teaches without examining it critically, and specifically asking whether or not any of the things that he says so often he finds fascinating or revealing or remarkable or beautiful, how that has anything to do with the truth value of the proposition of Jesus as the Messiah, as God. None of these things have anything to do with the truth value, and they are all easily explainable by naturalistic human history and methods and stuff like that. So he starts off thinking that, talking about Jesus, despite his humble background, lack of worldly power, somehow created a highly cohesive and advanced moral philosophy. having read the Bible, I mean, I'm currently rereading the Jewish annotated New Testament, as well as the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition of the Old Testament. How anyone can describe the philosophy of Jesus as highly cohesive and advanced, I just fail to grasp unless one is already accepting of Christian theology and saying, okay, because this says this, then that's what Jesus says, and so it's therefore moral and advanced. He's a, how such a profound philosophy emerged from someone with no apparent formal education. Well, I don't think most of Christian theology or philosophy actually emerged from Jesus. It emerged from literally centuries of Christians addressing various questions, trying to refute various theological attacks or the attacks of critics such as Celsus or Porphyrius. The Hebrews, the Jews of the time, the rabbis rejecting Jesus, because he didn't actually fulfill the messianic prophecies. I think that's quite clear. So the philosophy that Tavo is talking about did not come specifically from Jesus. It was an evolution of centuries of thinkers within Christianity. There were heretics that were discarded. There were so many early Christian sects. There was not a monolithic early idea of what Christianity was. I mean, the Gnostics alone were a fairly significant movement, but then they were rejected. So this idea that Jesus created a highly cohesive and advanced moral philosophy is simply unfounded. I don't understand how you can just blindly accept that. That's what it looks like to me. It sounds like blindly, credulously accepting what Jesus, what the church, any church, teaches about Jesus, and then reading it back into the Bible. And that's really what I see so much in this entire video, and which is part of the problem. If you already accept everything that Christianity says about Jesus, it's really easy to look back into the Bible and find everything that you want to find about Jesus, because the church has told you that, and so you look for it. And as they say, if you look for anything hard enough, you'll probably find it, even if it's only in your mind. So I don't care that Jesus allegedly had no formal education or intellectual lineage. That's simply an irrelevant point. It's not the way that Christian theology, dogma actually developed. It didn't all come from Jesus. So many things, that Christians say they believe have nothing to do with Jesus. They can't be found in the mouth of Jesus in any of the Gospels or things. So this simply is false. Jesus alone did not create all of Christian theology and this philosophy that he believes is so valuable and special and unique, because he really has this belief that Christianity is unique in some way. I don't accept that. I don't know how. I mean, he says he's read extensively in other philosophies and religions, and that's great, but he doesn't seem to have. I mean, I've read extensively in others as well, and I think they're just as profound. Honestly, I think Buddhism is far more profound than Christianity. I don't think the message of Jesus is all that special. Paul, I think, actually is better in many ways, at least if you look at the original letters of Paul. I think the later disputed letters, not so much. I think as they're getting farther along, he's going downhill. But I think that's really part of the bigger problem, is that most Christians today actually follow Paul and not Jesus. Because in the Gospels, especially in Matthew, which is certainly the most explicit, Jesus taught to follow the law of Moses and of the prophets. He did not have a unique special thing. I mean, when he talks about loving your God, love God before all else, and love your neighbor as yourself, and things like those are actually from the Old Testament. Both of those. I think the loving God above all others is from Deuteronomy, and the loving your neighbor as yourself, that one I think comes from Leviticus 19 somewhere. So those are not original. Tavo repeatedly says that there was no proto-Jesus ethos. Jesus didn't teach anything original. He really didn't. And this is where I just find him credulous. And I think that most Christians actually make this mistake. They think that Jesus really was original. He wasn't at all. Everything that Jesus teaches comes out of the Old Testament, out of the Hebrew scriptures. Jesus was a Jew. He was a Hebrew. He believed and followed, he taught to teach. He taught that you must follow the law until all is completed. And, until heaven and earth pass away, which it obviously hasn't. So according to Jesus, you're still supposed to be following the law of Moses. So I utterly reject Tavo's repeated assertion that Jesus had some kind of higher and more advanced moral philosophy that was beautiful. I mean, he talks at one point in this video about the beauty of Jesus's theology. I reject this completely. I don't think that much of anything in Jesus's theology was beautiful, because I don't think much of Hebrew, the law of Moses and the prophets, there's very little in there, except for, heck, the idea about loving your neighbor as yourself. I think, hopefully actually for many people, it's love your neighbor better than yourself, because a lot of people don't love themselves. And Christianity is unfortunately at fault for a lot of that. So this idea that Jesus was unique, advanced, more moral, and that than anybody else, and there was nothing like it before him, is utterly false. Christianity is an amalgamation of Greco-Roman thought, Hebrew thought, Zoroastrianism. The idea of like a god of evil, Satan, and a god of good, being a god, really comes from Zoroastrianism. So that was something that really influenced both the Hebrews and early Christians. So no proto-ethos of Jesus, as he said. I'm sorry, I don't know where he's getting this. He's simply ignoring that the influences that were all around Jesus at the time, and to think that Jesus was somehow completely independent of it is just naive and credulous. It's ignoring what we know about the world at that time. So in addition, and this is really one of the things, it's like so much of he's saying is, it's as if he's already accepting what the Bible says, and about what Jesus said, or what Christianity says about what Jesus said. We already know that none of the Gospels were eyewitnesses. Paul never met Jesus. Paul, got his information from other Christians. The Gospels were written anywhere from 30 to 70 years after Paul. So, there's plenty of scholars on YouTube that will tell you all about, how, heck, Luke probably copied from Josephus, quite possibly in the 2nd century. John, late 1st century, early 2nd century. Mark was probably after the fall of the temple, so like 70 to 75. Matthew was probably 70 to 80, something like that. So we don't actually know that the words of Jesus in the Bible are actually the words of Jesus. So to then say, oh, okay, but we can then take those words and essentially assume that they're true, even though we don't know that they're true. It's all hearsay, but we're going to accept that they're true, and then make the claim that they are unique, cohesive, advanced moral philosophies. That's a huge leap, and not one that's justified. You can't just say, to go from hearsay testimony to, wow, this is amazing philosophy and testimony, and Jesus must be like God because of it. What? I'm sorry. This is what's part of the problem, I think, with so many of these arguments. And it's not just Tavo. I hear this from other Christian apologists as well. So anyway, that's just this idea of Jesus as unique, special, advanced. There's so many assumptions built into that Jesus actually spoke those words, that somehow he actually spoke the entire Christian theology, in the Bible, and that there was no development of it afterwards, that there was no influence, from the broader societies and cultures of the time, that it was all Jesus. Everything came from Jesus and is so unique and special, is a completely unjustified and unsupportable conclusion. So to then say, okay, yep, and because of this, then I think that Jesus is most likely, the God, is just an unjustified leap. Uh, at one point, and this one, sorry, Tavo, I'm just going to call you out here. You talked about like there being ethnic diversity in Christianity, that there are, Christians in almost every indigenous society around the world. Are you somehow just ignoring the fact that Christianity from Europe essentially colonized, the entire most of Africa and South America, North America, with influence in Asia? There's pretty much no Christians among the Australian Aborigines, I don't think, but Christianity essentially conquered much of the Western world and imposed their theological frameworks and beliefs and stuff on those societies. And yes, many people, absorbed those and then, became convinced of them, whether their forefathers did or not. And so this is just blind credulity and ignoring how Christianity conquered the world by the sword. Because the spread of Christianity in the New World, in New North and South America, it was all by the sword. Massive extermination of indigenous populations, and the ones that survived were then forced into Christian schools, stripped, pulled away from their parents, taught that at a young age their former beliefs, their parents were devilish and evil and horrible. This was indoctrination of the absolute worst sort. So to claim that those ethnic groups of believers is somehow special and unique is just ignoring history. And it's kind of gross, actually. I'm just going to say it's gross, because it's ignoring how Christianity was spread and the just horrible ways that indigenous peoples were treated by Christian colonizers from Europe. That blew me away. You also wrote, so there was a point which she talks about, Jesus, the teachings of Jesus survived him, and Christianity was energized by his death. And he talks as if there was no recontextualization of Jesus after his death. I'm sorry. Have you not, I mean, everything I've said has already been addressing this, but this is just absurd, utterly absurd. Paul contradicts Jesus at almost every point. Jesus said the law is forever until heaven and earth pass away. Paul said that, nope, the law is, Jesus came to break the law and to get rid of it entirely. Jesus said that I'm not here to abolish the law. Paul said that he's here to abolish the law. What do you think that so much of the New Testament is? It's recontextualization of the Hebrew scriptures. It's the warping and recontextualization, which I think is a nice way of just saying abusing the Hebrew scriptures, twisting it to make it fit the new Christian narrative. Yes, there was recontextualization. That's just to say that didn't happen, given the centuries of development of Christian thought after Jesus died, is just naive and credulous and just inexcusable for someone who claims to be a critical thinker. Because all of it, everything that this is talking about, is all still based on hearsay testimony by anonymous authors, decades to centuries after the fact. Why should we accept that any of it's actually true? And none of this speaks to whether or not just Jesus is actually truly God, if this is a true proposition. And this is where I find so much of Christian apologetics to be deeply flawed. Just at its foundation is it's trying to take these books of hearsay testimony written decades after the fact, and then reinterpreted and reunderstood and for centuries, and that are still changing today. I mean, there is ongoing recontextualization today. It's still happening. It's never stopped. It's not to say that there was no period of decontextualization and recontextualization is just blindly ignorant of how Christianity has evolved over the last 2 millennia. It's silly. Um, then he gets into this idea of like, Jesus' core teachings of humility, love, and forgiveness. Well, a lot of that's really from Paul. Um, and then he tries to compare those three things to the Trinity. And so, I mean, I'm saying you're reading the Trinity back into the Bible. The Trinity is not in the Bible. And if you don't understand that, then you really don't understand the Bible and you haven't read it. You're taking your Christian beliefs of today's evolved theology and forcing them back into the Bible, making the Bible say things that it does not actually say. And that is recontextualization. That's the very definition of it. So trying to take those three values and relating them to the Trinity, I mean, sorry, this is recontextualization. This is creating theology that is not in the book. And he talks about like the most beautiful truths are likely the most valid, coming out of this. Those truths are beautiful, humility, love, and forgiveness are beautiful. They're the most beautiful, and therefore they're the most valid. Well, I mean, okay, beautiful is a subjective term. So I happen to find that, the teachings of the Buddha are more beautiful than the teachings of Jesus. Okay, so where does that leave us? You think those teachings of Jesus were beautiful. I think the teachings of the Buddha were more beautiful. What does that have to do with the truth value? Beauty is an irrelevant, completely irrelevant talking point here. So Tavo, I don't understand where you get it. Throughout this video, my impression was that you are looking for a reason to believe, and these things that you find fascinating and unique and unusual and not something you would expect, none of those have to do with truth value. You're looking for a reason to believe, and you're finding them because you're looking for them, and that's what Christians do. So, and then, by the way, at one point, he talks about the 10 Commandments are good moral rules. I wonder when the last time he actually read the 10 Commandments, because I recently reread them, and, number 10 talks about don't envy anything that your neighbor owns and any of your neighbor's properties, which includes women and slaves. Women and slaves were property in the Old Testament, in the commandments. It was in the 10th commandment. And that is a good moral rule. And like the first couple of moral rules that he thinks are so good and beautiful are just about making sure you worship God, because, God just really needs your worship. And that's what you have to do. Wow, good moral rules there. These are good moral rules, but God couldn't actually just outlaw, say, hey, no slavery. Owning people is bad. Wow. But hey, in the 10 Commandments, it says don't envy your neighbor's property, which includes slaves and women. No, the 10 Commandments are not good moral rules. And then he goes, the last part, he talks a little bit, I guess towards the end, he talks about, how untrained writers could have created such a theologically, thematically, literarily, and philosophically rich work when they weren't professional writers. I'm sorry, this is just, who says they were untrained writers? They obviously were, because they wrote in educated Greek. The literacy rate at the time was, 2 to 5%, 3 to 7%, maybe 10%, but even a number of those would have been able to just barely read and write. To the number of people who could write literary constructions that they did of the Gospels, they were obviously professional writers. You didn't get to be able to write at that time like that without being a professional writer. This is just absurd. Of course they were professional, and it was, some of the, Paul's letters were written a couple hundred years after, the disputed letters of Paul. I mean, they were definitely not written by Paul in the first century. There's absolutely no way. So that was just, I'm sorry, really? That's one of the problems. I think you're looking for reasons to believe something, and then you're creating these ideas, such as Christians. The early Christians weren't professional writers, so how could they have come up with this? Yes, they were professional writers. That's how they came up with it, because you didn't get to be able to write in clear, concise, literary Greek unless you were actually a professional writer. That's the whole teaching method that they had to go through, learning method, meant that they were professional writers. This is just absurd. How does this speak to truth anyway? This is gullibility. This is looking for a reason to believe something, not based on truth, but finding an excuse to believe it. And then the one thing he actually said, I kind of skipped over this one, I'm going to come back to it now, when he talked about using Jesus as a hermeneutical key for the Old Testament. So now he's already accepted, actually, I mean, he says that by accepting Jesus, now I can make sense of the Old Testament. Except for the fact that Jesus didn't actually fulfill any of the Old Testament prophecies in their original context, and you have to recontextualize them, Tavo, to make sense of them by making them spiritual or future, or, I said spiritual prophecies especially, it's a partial fulfillment. Yeah, I mean, if you're looking for reasons to make the New Testament fit the Old Testament, have you ever considered that maybe the authors of the New Testament were trying to make it make sense of the Old Testament? Maybe they were trying to, because they knew about the Old Testament, so they wanted to make Jesus fit the Messiah. They were trying to write it, except they were all writing in Greek. None of them wrote in Hebrew because they probably weren't even Jews. All of our earliest fragments of the New Testament are Alexandrian. They come from Greece. None of them, not a single fragment in the first century at least, is from, actually like Jerusalem or the area of Israel, because, and partially is because the Israelites were just completely driven out by the Romans around 150. I think it was 150, somewhere 125, 150, can't remember the date. But, the Romans just wrecked Israel, just destroyed them, drove all of them out. So, no, there are no writings, from Jesus, from any of the gospel writers, from Israel. They're all from Greece. They were in Greek. So, yeah, I mean, of course, the New Testament writers were trying to use the Old Testament to make sense of Jesus and vice versa. So, yeah, of course they were going to make it fit. And all of a sudden, oh, wow, it makes sense. Yeah, I can use Jesus to make sense of the Old Testament. And you know what? Mormons use their book to make sense of the New Testament, because Mormons abuse the New Testament just like Christians abuse the Old Testament. So this is really, this entire video was, and so many videos that I see of apologists when they're talking about, their conversion stuff, it's looking for a reason to believe. And it's not about, are these reasons related to actual truth? Can I justify these? Are these based on sound information? And the truth of the matter is, everything in the Bible, everything in the Gospels, everything in Paul's letters, Paul never met Jesus, all hearsay. Everything in the Gospels, written by anonymous authors, decades later, all heresy. Why would I base my eternal, and I don't care, by the way, if other religions, if their documentation doesn't come until even much later. It doesn't matter if it's a week, a month, a year, a decade, a century, whatever, or multiple centuries. It's still hearsay. That's all that matters. The earlier and closer it is still doesn't matter. It's still hearsay, and it's not reliable. Why should we trust it? The fact that, some of these books get some names right and some locations right and stuff like that, that's like saying that, Spider-Man is real because New York exists. Big deal. There is no logical, reasonable foundation for believing hearsay testimony from 2,000 years ago when you have no other proof. That's it. That's why I think his entire video is, and not just his, these are generalizable to many Christians. They are poor reasons for believing something about that a particular person was the divine incarnation of God 2,000 years ago. Not good enough.